Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Hi and welcome to Renewed Mind. I'm your host, Romel Gussain, and today we have with us Commissioner James Condon of the Salvation Army, who will be discussing with us a little bit about the history of the Salvos. First of all, welcome to the show, Commissioner.
Romel, thank you. It's good to have this opportunity to share with you and everybody who will be watching out there.
It's a pleasure. Now, as you heard, I'd like to learn a little bit about the history of the Salvos. Where did it all start? Who was its founder?
Reverend William Booth started the Salvation Army. He was a Methodist minister in London, in England, and he was very concerned about the poor, and particularly the people who were homeless and hungry, and the street children, particularly of the East End of London where he was. And so at one of his annual church conferences he spoke up and he wanted the church to do something to reach out to the poor. And he wasn't listened to. And in the history it records that he walked out of that annual conference meeting of the Methodist Church and thought, well, they don't want to do something, I'm going to do something to help the poor. And so he was a minister of the gospel, a minister of Jesus Christ, and he went and hired warehouses where he could encourage the homeless people to come and sleep, and they'd be provided with a warm blanket and some soup and some bread. That was where it all began, with this man, William Booth, who had a heart, a calling to serve the poor.
So James, what was William Booth's convictions? Why did he do it? Why was he so concerned about the poor?
Before he became a Methodist minister, a minister of the church, as a young man he worked in a pawn shop, a pawnbroker's shop. He saw the people coming there, giving their goods up, their household goods to get money, and saw people in desperate circumstances. And he felt that he had to do something. And he felt it was God's calling on him to do something as well. He had a heart for poor people. Yeah.
Does God ask Christians to help people in destitute, people that are poor?
Yes, I do believe God does ask. I mean, when we study the scriptures, like for example in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, and we read about Jesus saying, if you give some clothing to someone, if you give a cup of cold water, if you visit someone in prison, Jesus says, in doing that for someone, you're doing that for me. Wow. And that's part of that's our key motivation for what we do. And the message of Jesus, the example of Jesus in what he did.
And is that still the driving conviction of the Salvation Army?
Absolutely. Now, it doesn't mean that, 140 plus years later, since we began, that at times we don't have to call our people back to our original God-given mandate. There have been times when we've drifted away, wanted to go in a different direction, but we believe that God raised up the Salvation Army. It was God's idea. God has blessed it through its history since 1865, but we believe that we must stay with the vision God gave to William Booth and stay with the very purpose God raised up the Salvation Army.
Now, there are some people, whether they're Christian or not Christian, and they'll say something like, well, is it really our responsibility to help people that are struggling and that are suffering? Really, isn't that their problem? What would you say to someone that has that type of mindset?
I've been with the Salvation Army in full-time ministry as a minister of the Salvation Army for 40 years. And what I've found is that a person will come forward and say, I need help with this or that, help to pay some bills, help to pay the rent, help with some food, whatever. But so often you find that there's a greater problem behind that than the problem the person is presenting to you. Yeah.
And what are some of the different ways that the Salvation Army can help a person? I mean, a lot of people are familiar with the charity work that you do, but specifically, if someone that was homeless, would they be able to come to you? Someone that was on the verge of suicide, would they be able to come to the Salvation Army?
Well, the Salvation Army has grown a lot since William Booth began it. It's in 124 countries around the world, and that would vary from country to country in terms of the particular area of need that the Salvation Army would focus on in that country. But we're pretty well known worldwide for our service still today to homeless people. So we provide accommodation for homeless people, and that could be a homeless man, it could be a homeless woman, it could be a woman with children who's the victim of domestic violence, it could be a whole family needing accommodation. So we certainly still provide, according to the original mandate, services for homeless people. We provide food to people who are hungry. We provide counselling services. Our counselling services, qualified Christian counsellors who can help people with all sorts of problems. You mentioned earlier about suicide.
Yes.
Here in Australia, we have a 24-hour telephone counselling service known as Salvo Care Line. By the way, you use the word salvo, we're the Salvation Army, but in the Australian culture we're affectionately known as the Salvos. That's what they call us here.
Yes.
A lot of people in other parts of the world may not know what that means, but here we have Salvo Care Line, 24-hour telephone counselling service. That is staffed all by volunteers, and not just salvos, salvationists. Other Christians give of their time as well, and 24 hours a day you can phone up asking for advice, asking for help in terms of counselling or referral to one of our centres to get practical help. So in terms of, we're there, and there's not much that we can't help people with.
And that's a wonderful thing, to be able to come to someone and that they genuinely love you and they're concerned about you, and they're concerned about you from within and without. So if you're struggling with eternity, if you're struggling with loneliness, with why am I here, you can offer help, spiritual help. But also if you're struggling without the external difficulties, if you're a victim of some circumstance, the Salvation Army can help. Now, you shared with me a little bit earlier how the Salvation Army got started in Australia, and I'm hoping if you can reshare that to our viewers, the history.
Well, as I said, the Salvation Army started in the East End of London in 1865, now in 124 countries around the world, and it came to Australia in 1880. Came to the city of Adelaide, which is in South Australia. Salvation Army came in the person of a man, right? And he stood in a park in Adelaide under a tree, an Australian gum tree, and he preached the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. People gathered around in the park to listen, and at the end he said, if there's anyone out there that doesn't have a bed tonight or hasn't had a meal today, come home to my house.
Wow.
And that's how the Salvation Army began in Australia in 1880.
And do you encourage people to be able to help, whether they have time, whether they have money, to be able to get in contact with the Salvation Army and see if they can support it through these means?
Absolutely. Many people that we help finish up getting on this side, if you like, and reaching out and helping their fellow man that are in need. And you know, often you find that you give just something small to someone that just helps them at that critical point in their life, and then for the rest of their life they'll give back so much to people from all walks of life with all sorts of need.
And that was the story of your life somewhat. You were struggling, you were quite depressed, you were on the verge of suicide. You shared this with us on an earlier episode, and you found help. You found help and comfort in God. And it was quite practical, wasn't it?
It was, yes. You know, I think sometimes when people look at the uniform and a person in my position, they think, oh, well, that's the way he always was.
Yes.
You know? But no, that's not my story. Life was very different for me to what it is now, 44 years ago. Very different. Yes, I was on the point of suicide, seeing that I didn't have a future and hope, and God steered me in the way of the Salvation Army.
I mean,
and not just the Salvation Army, in the way of Jesus. Yeah.
Yes. And now, as the head of the Salvation Army in Eastern Division in Australia, you have been practicing Christian principles through the Salvation Army. Can you, perhaps if I put it this way, would you say that Christianity works? Does it actually work in helping people?
Yes, I believe it does. Today I'm the Commissioner of the Salvation Army, the head of the Salvation Army for Eastern Australia, but I believe that it's important that I keep in touch with what I might call real people, and I mean people on the street, people that are homeless, street kids, people in our drug and alcohol rehabilitation centres, the youth, etc., that I hear their stories. And it's my story many times over again in the lives of other people in different ways. So people continue to be helped by the Salvation Army, helped up physically, but helped to a new level spiritually. Their lives changed by Jesus Christ.
Wow.
Yes.
Has there been any stories that have perhaps affected you personally and touched you, which you could share with us? Some of the lives that have been transformed.
Yeah, look, I hear those stories every day, and that's what inspires me to continue and encourages me to continue in what I'm doing. But a story that readily comes to mind. We have what's called youth meetings, and we had one recently, just a couple of months back, up in the northern part of this state of New South Wales, and I met a young man who came up to me. This young man called me Commissioner, and I thought, who is this young man, you know? And so somewhere over the weekend I said to him, tell me your story. Cody is his name, and he wouldn't mind me mentioning his name. And he said, I was raised by my grandmother. My parents were drug addicts. He said, I never knew my mother, and still to this day he's never met his mother. And he said, the Salvation Army come knocking on the door of my grandmother. And he said, I was 5 at the time, and my grandmother said to the Salvation Army man knocking at the door in the uniform, do you have anything for a young boy? And the Salvation Army man said, yes, we have our Sunday school. And his grandmother said, can this boy, Cody, come? And the Salvation Army man said yes. So Cody started to attend the Salvation Army Sunday school and the church. He's just the most amazing young man now, 19 years of age, raised by his grandmother. Had a sad life really, because as I said, he never knew his mother, but the church became his mother and father. Wow. Right, because of the way the people in the church cared for him. It's got an amazing story. It's a wonderful story about the church, in our case, the Salvation Army, but caring for someone. And he would say, if he was talking to you here now, the church became my mother and father because of the people that came and picked me up to take me to Sunday school, to take me to the youth activities, to take me to the church, who cared about me and showed me what love is. And he shared that story with me, and I thought, wow, what a beautiful story. And today, that young man is talking to me about how he can serve God in the ministry as a minister of the gospel with the Salvation Army. And as I say, he's never met his mother. Part of his story is he used to go along to school and the kids would smell the drugs on his clothes because his father would be there, you know, smoking marijuana and that, and the kids would reject him. So he had rejection from his parents, rejection from the kids at school, used to be bullied, but the church was his mother and father. And here he is today, a young man ready to serve God. And I was so blessed to hear his story, And many people out there will be on Facebook. I'm on Facebook, and now he's a friend of mine on Facebook, and we chat on Facebook. I just said the other day, how you going, Katie? How's life for you at the moment, you know? So, yeah.
And it's wonderful to be able to find comfort in God. You know, God really does open himself up to us. It is God that we read about, that God demonstrated his love towards us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And we understand that when God did reveal his love for us, it wasn't that we were perfect people. It wasn't because we had money or we were important, you know, citizens, as it might be with some people. But it was when we were considered so far away from God, sinners, enemies of God, yet God would love us in such a way. And I think that there would be some people who perhaps have never really seen this side of Christianity, have never been able to see that Christianity really works. It does work, it helps people. And they might now be open to the possibility of exploring what God is, who God is, through the scriptures. Do you find that in people's lives that those that are Christians, they have a real stability and a real strength about them that you wouldn't find with someone who is apart from Christ?
Absolutely. And I mix with people from all walks of life, not just with the Christians in the Salvation Army or in other churches. I mix with business people because of my role. I belong to Rotary as a service club organisation. I mix with all sorts of people, have done all down through the years in my life. And look, there is an emptiness. It's not about what you have materially. I've known some very wealthy people who are very empty in life. Money doesn't buy you happiness. All the cars and the houses and properties and everything, that doesn't buy happiness. I've met some of the wealthiest people in the world, and when you really get inside them and talk to them, they're very empty. They need Jesus as much as the poor, the marginalised that we focus on. And yes, when they become Christians, whether they've been wealthy or poor, there is an absolute change in their life, a stability in their life, a strength in their life that they've never experienced before. They testify to it, they talk about it.
Yes, it's wonderful to be able to see that it's not just for those that are struggling, because some people do say things such as, oh, well, Christ or Christianity is a crutch for the weak. Now, while that is true to a certain extent, but it's not as though those who are well off don't need him. Is that what you've discovered?
Absolutely discovered that, yes.
Yes.
Because you look, here in Australia, we are big on suicide prevention and suicide bereavement support. We're one of the largest providers of suicide bereavement support in Australia. And I've been to key functions where I've met with families whose children, parents of children who've committed suicide, children who one of their parents has committed suicide. And when I hear the stories of their background that led to that, it's people of all walks of life. But there's just this emptiness that can't be filled with anyone else but God.
How would you help someone who is struggling? Perhaps you have a work colleague, a friend. How do you approach them? Now, often enough, it's the people that you're closest to that you might be more open to discuss some of your personal problems. And because of your extensive history with the Salvation Army, what are some of the counselling tips or approaches in which someone is able to help someone or lead someone in terms of a specific problem?
I believe one of the great needs of the world today, and it doesn't matter who it is, people want someone to listen to them. I believe that it's absolutely critical.
Okay.
Too many people talk too much.
Yes.
But people want someone to listen, someone to tell their story. And I have sat sometimes for hours and just listened to someone tell their story. So I really believe there's a great need in the world today for people to be listened to. Yeah.
Yes. And so someone that would have a specific problem, say with a substance abuse, does the Salvation Army provide for them some type of care or some type of help to be able to let go of that addiction?
Yes, absolutely. Here in Australia and in
Yes.
other parts of the world as well, we have rehabilitation services which focus on people with addictions. Addiction to alcohol, addiction to drugs, and addiction to gambling particularly. And they are all real challenges in today's society, addictions in those three areas. And the Salvation Army is able to offer help. But the person with addictions needs to want help. They
Yes.
can't be forced into it. When I said a moment ago about being there to listen to people, it's not about preaching at people. It's being available to help people at their point of need. And yes, we have here and in other parts of the world, as I say, rehabilitation services. Here in Australia, they're 9-month residential programs that we operate. People from all walks of life, young people who are teenagers who have addiction problems, businessmen who've turned to alcohol or drugs, successful businessmen, professional people, lawyers who have addiction problems, and one that's emerging, which is a new challenge, is addiction to pornography too. And the cycle needs to be broken. The power of that needs to be broken. And it's not just in rehabilitation. Only Jesus can break the power of sin.
Yes, yes. And it's a wonderful thing for people to be able to see that God is there in every way and He has the power. Often enough we are powerless to prevent or to change things about ourselves. If you look at your own New Year's resolution, for argument's sake, often many of us can't even keep it.
Yeah.
Yet when you do come to God and you ask for Him to help you, He is more than willing and more than available to be able to help you. Now, for those people who don't know anything about Jesus Christ, how is it that we can have a relationship with God? How is it that we can come to Him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, you touched on a very important point there about the power that is available. If I think about people with addiction problems, sometimes in some of our services we follow the 12 steps of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the first step is to admit that we were powerless over our addiction. And that's a very important step, that really our life is out of control. And people try all sorts of things to find answers, and I'm not just talking about addictions, whatever their needs are in life. If they've lived, a wrong sort of a life, they need forgiveness. People, doesn't matter whether they believe in God or not, people still have a conscience and they still carry guilt. And the power of God that comes to us to help us to be, even to use the biblical term, to be overcomers, whatever we're struggling with in our life, it's available. God's power is incredible.
And how can we receive that? How can we receive God's power? How do we come to know Him?
How do we come to know Him? Simply by praying. And people might say, well, how do I pray? I tell you, just talk to God as if you're talking to someone else.
Yes.
You don't have to say any special words in any special way. Just tell God what you need and ask Him to help you. And look, I've heard so many people just say, I cried out to God, God help me. And God came. And God does answer a prayer. Don't worry about the words or even the thought it's a prayer. I don't know how to pray. Just talk to God as if you're talking to someone else and tell Him what your need is. And God will come to you. God will come to you in different ways. I've been hearing stories recently of God appearing to people. Someone waking up in the night and seeing Jesus as they understood Him to be Jesus, standing at the end of their bed. Physical appearance of Jesus. God comes to us through other people. Right? And I've seen that happen as well. So God comes to us in different ways, but just cry out to God. God is there.
Commissioner, thank you for your time. As you've been able to hear Commissioner James speak to us and share with you that God is a God of love, and whatever your problem is, regardless of how low you've stooped, He is there to be able to help you. Or perhaps everything on the external form seems to be fine. People see you and everything seems to be rosy and dainty, but on the inside you're struggling and there is an emptiness there. Well, God can help you with that. We hope that through this episode of Renewed Mind, you will be able to discover the wonderful and great God. Please stay in tune for the very next episode, and may God bless you.